G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here. I'm here to talk to you this time about the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is based on the natural law philosophical tradition which harks back to at least the time of Aristotle. It's a morally rich principle, very different to what one often reads in the literature. It does have relevance to the issue of government. What is government's purpose? How many tiers of government we should have? The structure of government, where we should look at federations or not. But it also has broader relevance to moral issues, such as a paper that I recently had published looking at the principle of subsidiarity and the various COVID-19 responses to it. Sadly, the principle of subsidiarity has been the victim of minimalist interpretations. In fact, it's probably the most misconstrued concept that you'll find in the scholarly literature. What you'll generally read by luminaries such as Wallace Oates, the doyen of federalism scholarship, is that the principle simply means that the lowest level of government will deliver goods and services. Now, that's totally contrary to natural law, totally denudes the concept of its moral foundation. And in fact, natural law philosophers only see government as an instrument for delivering the common good. They don't see government as an ontological state at all. And in fact, they prefer that power and competence is dispersed to a plurality of social forms rather than government being involved in everything. So what you will generally read in the literature is incorrect. It's a very poor characterization of the principle, and it really should be referred to as the principle of decentralization because it's just a preference for decentralized government. The principle of subsidiarity in natural law is much, much richer. It's all about balancing human dignity, which is a right of one to pursue one's existential ends without undue interference, against the common good, the help accruing to people as a result of their cooperation, which is more than the sum of parts. I did a video on these two concepts earlier. So it's all about striking a balance between two things that can often be at odds. Now, its purpose is to ensure that the current dispersion of power and competence remains, that we don't see concentrations of power and competence, because when we do, it leads us to things like Nazi Germany. Pius, when he was articulating this concept in 1931, he had in mind the rise of National Socialism, the rise of communism. And he saw that in both these situations, what was happening was the common good was being unduly preferenced, and human dignity was being severely eroded, and that this would end up in bad and evil outcomes, which history tells us it did. There's two obligations in the principle of subsidiarity. The first one is a negative prohibition against subsuming the functions of people and their associations. Hardly surprising. If we want to maintain this plurality of social forms, we need to stop government, or any other larger association for that matter, taking over the functions which rightfully belong to people or smaller associations. So the principle of subsidiarity has a preference for things being done at the smallest level of association possible. Sometimes that's the individual, often that's the family, the fundamental association of society. Very rarely is that government of any level. That's the negative prohibition. Don't take over things which aren't part of your legitimate remit. And Pius said that if you do so, you will be crushed under the financial and other burdens that you've needlessly taken on to yourself. It was a warning to government, and if you look at the levels of sovereign debt, you know that Pius was right. The positive commandment is that subsidium, loosely translated as help, I'll go into it a bit more in a second, must be provided for bona fide need. It's not a choice. When a person or a small association needs help, then it must be provided. It is a moral obligation, because failure to do that means that that person or that smaller association will fail, which means that they will no longer be able to bring their gift to society, their munera to society, which means that we will all be worse off for it. It's not a preference, it is a commandment, a moral obligation to help when it is legitimately required. Subsidium, it's a Latin term. It's derived from this idea of what the Romans used to do with their military. They used to always hold, apparently, one section of troops in reserve near the general. And if a battle line weakened somewhere, they'd send those troops in to strengthen that battle line, push forward. As soon as momentum was their way, they'd pull them back straight away, put them back in reserve so that they could help in the next emergency. And that is how Subsidium should be delivered. We should help when it's required, but as soon as the person or the smaller associations are on their feet, we must withdraw that again so that we can use that help for other things, and also so that we don't create a state of dependency, because dependency is not dignity. To use a word from Moses Maimonides, a Jewish natural law philosopher, hesed. Subsidium is hesed. It's all forms of loving kindness. People have it in their head that to provide subsidium, we just need to give people money. Often that's not what people need. They'll need some loving care, some direction, some advice. Just handing out money, in fact, is one of the lowest forms of charity, one of the least admirable forms of charity. It does very little for the recipient and really only assuages the guilt of the donor. It's not effective. So what we're talking about here is not money, it's all forms of help, and it must be delivered in a way to make it superfluous as quickly as possible. We must build in redundancy from the very beginning. From the first moment we think about giving help, we must be thinking, how can we give this help in such a way that it can be removed as soon as it's no longer needed? Because if we don't build in redundancy, we will build up dependency, and dependency is not a state of human dignity, as many people have sadly learnt through this COVID crisis, who have lost their job, who are now dependent on government. It's not the same as working a job yourself and charting your own course. It doesn't give you a feeling of fulfillment. It simply leaves you needing more in the future. It's not really help at all. So in conclusion, the principle of subsidiarity is so much more than government, lowest level of government delivering services. In fact, it's a preference for government usually keeping out of things, for having lots of association and having power and competence dispersed across this wide range of associations, particularly the family. And when we fail to observe the principle of subsidiarity, we set ourselves up for situations like Nazi Germany, like some of the oppressive communist regimes, where terrible things happen. And we also suck out the existential space for associations and people to do what they want to do, to be creative, to respond to need, and to flourish. So please reject the minimalist interpretations you might read and embrace the natural law perspective of the principle of subsidiarity. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.